Budapest, October 1944. The Hungarian capital is caught between collapsing allegiances. Admiral Horthy has just announced an armistice with the Soviet Union in a desperate attempt to extricate Hungary from the Axis alliance. Within hours, the announcement is nullified by a German-backed Aerocross coup. Soviet forces are advancing from the east. German troops occupy key positions throughout the city. And in a secure facility on FO Utka, Hungarian military intelligence officers are making decisions about which files to destroy, which to hide, and which to offer as bargaining chips to whichever power emerges victorious. Among those officers is his Reeds, Colonel Peter Nagi, Section 2B of Hungarian military intelligence, specializing in Soviet order of battle and Red Army capabilities. Born 1908 in Debrecen, career officer, recruited into intelligence work in 1936. His personnel file shows continuous service analyzing Soviet military capabilities, a role that made him valuable to both his German allies and, potentially, to the Soviets themselves. On October 16, 1944, the day after Horthy's armistice announcement and the day after the Aerocross coup, Nagi is scheduled to attend a coordination meeting with German aware officers at their headquarters near the Castle District. A meeting log shows his name on the attendance roster, but a notation in the margin, discovered decades later in fragmentary Hungarian military archives, reads, Nagi, canceled, urgent reassignment per section chief authorization. That same evening, a fragmentary Hungarian intelligence cable references Section 2B personnel transferred to secure location pending clarification of political situation. No names, no specific location. Just a reference number that corresponds to nothing in surviving Hungarian military archives. On October 18th, an Aerocross internal security memo lists military intelligence personnel to be detained for unreliable loyalty and suspected Bolshevik sympathies. Nagi's name appears on the list, underlined twice, marked for immediate arrest, but there is no record of his arrest, no detention order, no interrogation transcript, no execution notice. On October 23rd, a Soviet NKVD field report file from the outskirts of Budapest mentions reception of Hungarian intelligence officer with detailed knowledge of Axis order of battle and German-Hungarian intelligence cooperation, currently being transferred to Moscow for extensive debriefing. No name given, just a notation. Source Gemini, high-value intelligence asset. When Budapest finally fell to Soviet forces in February 1945, after a brutal siege that left tens of thousands dead and the city in ruins, Hungarian military intelligence records were either destroyed, captured by the Soviets, or seized by fleeing Germans. What remained was fragmentary, contradictory, incomplete, but in the chaos of occupation and regime change, thousands of Hungarian officers were documented, their fates recorded in Soviet occupation files, in war crimes tribunal records, in the bureaucratic machinery of the communist government that would rule Hungary for the next 4 decades. Is Reed's Peter Nagi appeared in none of these records, not in Soviet detention lists, not in Hungarian Communist Security Service files, not in war crimes investigations, not in the purges that consumed thousands of former Horthy regime officials. For a senior intelligence officer whose expertise and position should have made him a priority for Soviet intelligence services or Hungarian communist authorities, the complete absence was extraordinary, and it would remain unexplained for 81 years. Hungarian military intelligence during World War II operated in an increasingly impossible position. Officially allied with Germany, Hungary's intelligence services were simultaneously trying to preserve some degree of independence, maintain secret contacts with Western powers, and prepare for the possibility of Soviet occupation. Officers like Nagi, specializing in Soviet military analysis, walked a particularly precarious line. Their expertise made them valuable to the Germans, but that same expertise could make them targets for Soviet retribution when the Red Army arrived. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to support the channel. Nagi's career file, reconstructed from fragmentary Hungarian military archives that survived the war and were later accessed by researchers, shows a pattern of careful professionalism in a dangerous role. Junior officer in the late 1930s, analyzing Soviet military developments, promoted to senior analyst position in 1940 as Hungary moved closer to the Axis alliance. By 1942, he was producing detailed assessments of Soviet military capabilities for Hungarian military leadership and, by extension, for their German allies who maintained liaison officers in Budapest. A fitness report from March 1944, preserved in captured documents, described him as analytically rigorous, politically circumspect, professionally valuable for Soviet threat assessment, ideologically uncommitted. The phrase politically circumspect was telling. It suggested someone who avoided open political declarations, who kept his own counsel in dangerous times when loyalty tests were becoming more frequent and more severe. In the chaotic final months of Hungarian participation in the war, as Soviet forces approached Hungarian territory and Horthy's government desperately sought an exit from the German alliance, Nagi's section was responsible for assessments of Soviet intentions and capabilities. His work would have given him detailed knowledge not just of Soviet military strength, but Hungarian intelligence methods, German liaison procedures, and a fractured political situation within Hungary's military establishment. The circumstances of his disappearance on October 16, 1944, remain unclear even in fragmentary records that survived. The urgent reassignment that kept him from the German coordination meeting was never explained in surviving documentation. The secure location referenced in the intelligence cable was never identified, and the arrow cross-detention order issued 2 days later suggests that someone in the new regime considered him a security risk. But there is no evidence the order was ever executed. When Soviet forces compiled lists of Hungarian military personnel for investigation and possible prosecution, Nagi's name appeared on preliminary rosters developed from captured Hungarian military documents. He was flagged as having held a senior position in intelligence operations that had supported the Axis war effort against the Soviet Union. Men in comparable positions face interrogation, detention, and in many cases, prosecution or execution as the communist government consolidated power. But there was no record of Soviet detention, no interrogation transcript in NKVD files that were later partially accessed by researchers, no indication that he had been processed through machinery of Soviet occupation justice that consumed thousands of Hungarian military and government officials. In 1946, the Hungarian Communist government, consolidating power under Soviet supervision, conducted extensive purges of former Horthy regime officials, particularly those who had served in military or intelligence roles. Trials were public spectacles, confessions were extracted through interrogation, sentences were carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. The process was thorough, methodical, and well documented in files that would later be open to researchers. Nagi's name appeared in none of the proceedings. No arrest, no trial, no sentence, no execution notice in the meticulous records kept by the Communist Security Services. In 1947, a Hungarian government commission investigating collaboration with Nazi Germany requested information about Nagi from Soviet authorities controlling access to captured Hungarian intelligence files stored in Moscow. They wanted to know whether he had been detained by Soviet forces during or after the siege, whether he had died during the fighting, whether any information about his fate existed in Soviet records. The Soviet response, delivered through official diplomatic channels, stated, Subject Peter Nagi, former Hungarian military intelligence, no current information available in accessible records. Disposition unknown. The commission noted the response and closed the inquiry. Nagi was classified officially as missing, presumed killed during Budapest siege, October 1944 to February 1945. Through the 1950s and 1960s, under communist rule, historians researching Hungarian military intelligence operations occasionally encountered Nagi's name in captured operational reports and organizational charts held in state archives. He appeared as a senior analyst, someone whose work had been considered important enough to circulate at high levels within the military command structure. But there was never any information about what had happened to him after October 1944. The standard reference works on Hungarian military personnel listed him as fate unknown, presumed died during Arrow Cross period or Budapest siege. Most historians assumed he had been killed during the chaotic final months, either executed by the Arrow Cross as a suspected Soviet sympathizer or killed during the brutal street fighting that consumed the city for months. The silence around his case was not obviously managed. It looked like the ordinary confusion of a violent period, the gaps that existed throughout Hungarian military records from the war's final months. Just one more officer whose fate became unclear in the chaos of regime change, occupation, and purges. Unless someone looked closely enough to notice that the gaps followed a pattern, that key documents were missing at specific moments, that inquiries were deflected with identical language across multiple archives and decades. Dr. Anna Molnar was researching Hungarian military intelligence during World War II, focusing on officers who had specialized in Soviet analysis and their fates during and after the war. A historian at Yavuz University in Budapest, Molnar had spent years working through Hungarian, Soviet, and Western archives, trying to understand how Hungarian intelligence had operated during the war and what happened to its personnel afterward. In 2024, while reviewing recently declassified Soviet intelligence files released by the Russian government as part of the Historical Transparency Initiative, she found a document that immediately caught her attention. It was a 1947 NKVD personnel assessment discussing Hungarian intelligence assets currently employed in analytical capacity. The memo listed several criteria for evaluating such personnel: depth of knowledge regarding Western military capabilities, willingness to continue cooperation with Soviet intelligence, political reliability assessed through wartime behavior, value for ongoing operations against Western powers in the emerging Cold War. One entry read, Source Gemini, Peter Nagi, former Hungarian Section 2B. Extracted October 1944 Budapest per prior arrangement with Liaison Network. Provided extensive debriefing on Hungarian-German intelligence cooperation, Western military capabilities, as assessed by Axis intelligence services, and organizational structures of Hungarian military intelligence apparatus. Currently employed Moscow headquarters. Analysis of Western intelligence methods and Hungarian émigré networks. Classification. Protected source. Identity protection permanent given sensitivity of extraction circumstances and continued operational value. Gemini, a code name, and a revelation. Nagi hadn't died during the chaos of October 1944. He had been extracted by Soviet intelligence through some kind of prior arrangement and had been working for Soviet intelligence ever since. Molnar requested additional files related to Gemini from Russian archives. The response came months later. Requested materials remain classified under Russian Federation security protocols. Access denied. She tried different approaches, searching for cross-references in other partially declassified archives. In a 1952 Soviet intelligence document, partially released in 2019, she found a reference to Hungarian specialist personnel providing analysis of Western intelligence operations and émigré anti-communist activities. In a 1958 KGB memo discussing personnel working on Western operations, there was a paragraph about former Hungarian military intelligence officer, extensive experience analyzing Western military capabilities, continued employment in analytical section targeting NATO intelligence services. None named Nagi explicitly, but the timeline, the specialty, and the code name Gemini all aligned with background and expertise. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 2025, Hungarian State Security Archives released a collection of documents from the 1950s related to surveillance of Hungarian émigré communities in the West. Among them was a 1956 report discussing intelligence regarding émigré organizations provided by Moscow-based sources with Hungarian military background. One paragraph mentioned, Source Gemini continues to provide valuable analysis of émigré leadership structures and potential Western intelligence connections. Subject's knowledge of former Hungarian military personnel now residing in West proves operationally useful for assessing security risks and identifying targets for recruitment operations. 12 years after Nagi's disappearance, he was still working for Soviet intelligence, still providing analysis based on his knowledge of Hungarian military and intelligence networks. But the most revealing document came from CIA files released in early 2025. A 1960 report discussed Soviet intelligence assets of Hungarian origin working against Western targets. The report included a section on high-value sources whose cooperation predates Soviet occupation of Hungary. One paragraph read, Gemini, believed to be former Hungarian military intelligence officer extracted by Soviet services October 1944. Subject's cooperation appears to have begun prior to extraction, suggesting penetration of Hungarian intelligence by Soviet services during wartime period. Subject reportedly employed in Moscow, conducting analysis of Western intelligence methods and Hungarian émigré networks. Identity remains unknown despite efforts. Attempt to identify through defector debriefings unsuccessful. Prior to extraction, the phrase suggested Nagi hadn't simply been captured or opportunistically recruited during the chaos. He had been working with Soviet intelligence before his disappearance, possibly for months or even years while still serving in his official capacity. A follow-up CIA assessment from 1963 noted, fragmentary intelligence suggests Gemini may have been providing information to Soviet services as early as 1943, while still actively serving in Hungarian military intelligence. If accurate, this would represent significant Soviet penetration of Hungarian intelligence apparatus during critical period of war, with potential implications for security of German intelligence operations conducted through Hungarian liaison. But crucial questions remain unanswered, protected by classification barriers spanning multiple countries. When had Nagi's cooperation with Soviet intelligence actually begun? What had motivated his decision to provide information to the enemy? What specific intelligence had he provided before and after his extraction? And what had ultimately happened to him? Molnar filed requests for full declassification of Gemini files with Russian authorities. The responses stated that materials related to intelligence operations during World War II remain classified under current security protocols, that information regarding sources remained protected regardless of time elapsed, that no additional release was authorized. She found one final document in a 2026 release of Soviet administrative files, a 1978 memo discussing pension arrangements for retired intelligence personnel whose wartime service remains classified. The memo noted, Gemini Peter Nagi, deceased 1977, 33 years service in analytical capacity, specialized knowledge Hungarian military structures and Western intelligence methods. Subject maintained classification throughout service period and retirement. Identity never disclosed to Hungarian authorities. Recommendation: continued classification of subjects' cooperation and service given diplomatic sensitivity and protection of additional sources recruited through similar wartime arrangements. 33 years after his extraction, Nagi had worked for Soviet intelligence for over 3 decades, analyzing Western intelligence operations, assessing émigré networks, providing expertise based on his Hungarian military background and his identity, his survival. His entire post-war life had remained classified, hidden from Hungarian authorities who had listed him as dead for over 30 years. The final revelation wasn't just that Nagi had survived and worked for Soviet intelligence. It was a timeline. The strong suggestion that his cooperation had begun while he was still serving in Hungarian military intelligence, that he had been a Soviet source inside the Hungarian military establishment during the war itself, providing information that may have shaped Soviet operations and intelligence assessments during the critical final years of the conflict. The truth about his reads Peter Nagi is no longer completely hidden. It exists in fragmentary declassified documents scattered across Russian, American, and Hungarian archives. He was extracted by Soviet intelligence in October 1944 through a prearranged operation. He worked for Soviet intelligence for 33 years analyzing Western intelligence methods and Hungarian émigré networks. He died in 1977, his identity and service remaining classified. Strong evidence suggests his cooperation began before his extraction, possibly as early as 1943, while he was still actively serving Hungarian military intelligence. But the full story remains sealed behind classification barriers. The documents that would answer essential questions. When exactly did his cooperation begin? What specific intelligence did he provide while still officially serving Hungary and its Axis allies? How many operations did his information enable or compromise? What motivated his decision to work for Soviet intelligence? Did his information reach German intelligence through Hungarian liaison channels? Those documents remain classified in Moscow. In 2026, a retired Russian intelligence officer, speaking anonymously to a Western journalist, said something revealing. The Nagi case represents the most sensitive category of wartime operations, penetration of Allied intelligence services. He wasn't just recruited after being captured. Evidence suggests he was working for us while still serving Hungarian military intelligence, which was allied with Germany and sharing information with German services. Revealing the full extent of his cooperation would mean admitting how deeply Soviet intelligence had penetrated Axis intelligence apparatus during the war. That's not something that serves current diplomatic interests, even 80 years later. Some wartime operations remain too sensitive to fully declassify. Molnar's research revealed something beyond Nagi's individual story. In the declassified documents, she found references to similar cases designated by similar astronomical code names: Gemini, Orion, Cassiopeia, Perseus. Each described as Hungarian intelligence personnel, wartime cooperation initiated pre-1945, extracted during collapse, identity protection permanent. Each file remained largely classified. Each story remained incomplete. In early 2026, Molnar received an anonymous message through an encrypted email service. You found Gemini. Ask why only pieces of the story were released. Ask what would happen if the full scope of Soviet penetration of Hungarian intelligence was revealed. Ask how many other officers were working for Soviet intelligence while serving Axis allied governments. Ask what intelligence flowed to Moscow through these sources during the war. The revelation left historians stunned because it was supposed to control disclosure enough to acknowledge the operation's existence, while keeping the operational details that would truly change historical understanding sealed. Some secrets served better purposes, remaining incomplete. 81 years after his reads, Peter Nagi disappeared from Hungarian military intelligence headquarters and was extracted by Soviet intelligence. Part of his story is known. Strong evidence suggests he worked as a Soviet source while still officially serving Hungary, possibly from 1943 onward. He was extracted in October 1944 through prearranged coordination. He served Soviet intelligence for 33 years analyzing Western targets. He died in 1977. His identity remained classified throughout and beyond his lifetime, but the full truth remains locked behind classification barriers that may never be lifted. The documents that would reveal when his cooperation truly began, what intelligence he provided while still officially serving Hungary and its Axis allies, how many operations he enabled, how many networks he compromised, whether German intelligence was affected through Hungarian liaison channels. Those remain classified in Moscow. Because Nagi's story isn't just about one officer who switched sides. It's about the possibility that Soviet intelligence had penetrated deep into Hungarian military intelligence during the war, that information was flowing to Moscow from inside an Axis-allied intelligence service, that the intelligence picture during the war's final years was more compromised than has ever been publicly acknowledged. The streets of Budapest are quiet now, rebuilt from the devastation of the 1944 to 1945 siege. The building on Fo Utka that housed Hungarian military intelligence is offices now. No marker indicates what happened there in October 1944, who disappeared, who was extracted, who was working for the other side while still wearing the uniform. History records the siege, the Arrow Cross coup, the Soviet occupation, the communist takeover. But the individual betrayals, the specific penetrations, the officers who were working for the other side while still serving their official allegiances, those remain partially sealed behind classifications that span multiple governments in 81 years. A World War II mystery kept secret for 81 years. The final revelation left historians stunned, but only partial revelation. The full scope of what Nagi did, when he truly began cooperating, what intelligence he provided during the war itself while still serving Hungary, how deeply Soviet intelligence had penetrated Hungarian military intelligence, that remains classified. And maybe that's the point. To reveal enough to acknowledge that Soviet intelligence penetrated Hungarian military intelligence. To confirm that at least one senior officer was working for Moscow while officially serving the Axis alliance. But not enough to reveal the full extent of that penetration, the full scope of the compromise, the complete timeline of betrayal, the full list of what intelligence flowed to Moscow from inside Axis allied services. The revelation stunned historians because it confirmed what some suspected but couldn't prove, that the intelligence war was more complex, more compromised, more successfully penetrated than the official histories acknowledge. But the files that would show just how deep the penetration went how early it began, how much intelligence flowed to Moscow from inside Axis Allied services during the war itself. Those files remain sealed, and they may never be opened. If you like this story, please subscribe to support this channel.